A door locks behind her in the dark. One cold, final click. And a woman is left standing in the snow with 2 children and everything they own in 2 burlap sacks. The warm yellow light of the house glows on without her now. It belongs to someone else. She does not cry. She does not beg. She simply turns and walks her children straight into the freezing night, toward a place the whole town swears is cursed. A hole in the ground. A buried ruin where the last soul to seek shelter was found frozen by his own dead fire. Everyone tells her it is a grave. Everyone tells her she is burying her children alive. And far out beyond the ridge, in a terrible silence, something enormous is beginning to move. She has one winter to prove them wrong. A widow stood alone in the freezing wind, and behind her, a door she had walked through 1,000 times clicked shut. The sound was small, a single turn of a metal latch, but it carried across the porch like something breaking that could never be mended. Marin Hartwell did not turn around right away. She kept her eyes on the gray fields ahead, where the first thin dusting of winter snow drifted low over the dead grass, moving like it was searching for somewhere to settle. 2 children pressed close against her coat. Asa, 11 years old, stood as straight as he could make himself stand. His jaw was set hard, the way a boy's jaw gets when he is trying not to cry in front of his mother. Posey, only 7, clung to Marin's sleeve with both small hands. Her shoes tapped softly against the porch boards because her legs would not stop shaking. Everything they still owned in the world sat in 2 burlap sacks at their feet. Inside the house, the lamps were still burning. Warm yellow light spilled through the windows and across the snow. The supper plates were still on the table. From where she stood, Marin could almost believe nothing had changed. But it had. The farmhouse that had been her husband's. The home where she had carried both her children up the stairs as babies belonged to someone else now. It belonged to Garrick. Her late husband's younger brother stood just behind the glass, watching the 3 of them in the cold. There was no shouting in him, and no turning away. His face held no anger at all. And somehow that stillness was crueler than any shouting could have been. After a long moment, the door opened. Garrick Kincaid stepped out onto the porch in his clean wool coat. The light from inside framed his polished boots, while the rest of the yard fell away into the dark. He held out a thin envelope. "It isn't much," he said quietly, "but it's enough to get the 3 of you south before the snow closes the roads." Marin looked at the envelope. She did not reach for it. "You don't have to do this, Garrick. I'm doing you a kindness." His voice stayed low and even. "A woman alone, with 2 children, in a winter like the one that's coming. That isn't pride. That's foolishness." He glanced down at Posey, then back at Marin. "My brother would have wanted them somewhere safe, somewhere warm, not freezing in a country that's already taken enough." The words landed soft as snow and cut twice as deep. Asa lowered his eyes. Marin felt the boy shrink beside her, and that, more than the cold, more than the locked door, was the thing that nearly broke her. She took the envelope, not because she believed him, but because there was nothing left to argue for. Garrick nodded as though something difficult had finally been settled. "There's a train station 2 days' walk south," he said. "Be on it before the first real storm." Then he stepped back inside his brother's house, and the warm yellow light closed behind him like a wound healing over. Maren stood there a moment longer. She did not weep. She did not beg. She simply gathered the 2 sacks, took her children by the hand, and walked out into the dark prairie where the snow drifted low across the ground, like ghosts looking for a place to lie down. But the widow did not take her children to the train station. The next morning, in the gray light before the town had fully woken, she walked them into the county land office instead. The building smelled of coal smoke and damp wool and old paper. A wood stove ticked in the corner. Behind the counter sat an older woman with silver hair pinned back and tired, kind eyes. A clerk named Della Mott, who had watched a great many desperate families pass through that door. Della listened without interrupting. Then she slid a heavy ledger across the counter, a record of abandoned claims, land nobody wanted, cabins nobody would live in. Maren ran one finger down the page, past prices she could not begin to afford, until she stopped. The cheapest property on the page, a dugout cabin, 5 acres, $41. Della saw where her finger had landed, and the kindness in her face turned to worry. "Not that one," the older woman said softly. "Folks around here call it the frost pit." Maren did not lift her finger. The last man who tried to winter in it? Della hesitated, choosing her words. He didn't see spring. They found him froze through, sitting up by his own hearth. Posey pressed closer against her mother's side. Asa stared at the number on the page, and Maren could feel the question forming in him, the same question Garrick had planted the night before. What if he was right? Maren was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the only thing that mattered to her. "Does it still have a roof?" Della blinked. Of all the questions she had expected, that one had not been on the list. "Most of one," she admitted. "Then I'll take it." The older woman looked at her for a long while, at the worn coat, at the 2 children, at the stubborn, steady set of the widow's shoulders. And then she did something she had not done for any family in a long time. She counted out the change slowly and tucked a folded dollar back across the counter when Maren wasn't looking. "There's a creek about half a mile below the draw," Della said gently as she stamped the papers. "Cold, but it runs most of the winter. You'll want to know that." She paused. "And you'll want to know where the wind comes from out there. It doesn't blow the way it does anywhere else." Maren met her eyes and understood she had just been handed something more valuable than the change. By late afternoon, the road into the draw barely deserved the name. Maren pulled a small handcart through dead grass and broken stone, while Asa shoved from behind whenever the wheels jammed in the old frozen ruts. Posey walked between the sacks, asking again and again how much farther. Maren did not answer. She was listening to the wind. It moved strangely through the low country, vanishing for a breath, then slamming sideways hard enough to rock the cart toward the ravine. It never held one direction for long, and the deeper they walked into the draw, the more she understood something about that land that frightened her more than the cold ever could. The cold out here did not feel empty. It felt patient, like something that had learned to wait. They saw the cabin at last, just before the sun gave up the sky. It barely rose above the slope, as if the earth had been slowly swallowing it for years. Half the sod roof had fallen inward, One stone wall leaned toward a long crack. The door hung crooked on a single rusted hinge, and the wind slipped through the loose boards with a low, hollow whistle. No smoke, no tracks, no sign that anything living had been there in a very long time. Asa reached the doorway first, trying so hard to be brave. He took one look inside and stopped. Behind him, Posey began to cry quietly into her scarf. Marin walked the outside of the cabin while the last light drained away. And on the north side, she found the worst of it. That whole wall had nearly disappeared, buried under packed dirt and dead roots and old drifted snow gone hard as stone. The place did not look abandoned. It looked buried. And standing there in the rising dark, with her 2 children shivering at her back and $41 worth of frozen earth in front of her. Marin Hartwell understood she might have just carried her children into the one place even winter had decided to call home. She did not turn back. She set down the sacks, and in the failing light, she stepped through the crooked door, into the dark. The first nights nearly broke her. Not her spirit. Her body. The cold inside that buried cabin was a different creature than the cold outside. Outside, at least the wind gave a person something to push against, something to fight. Inside, the cold simply settled in and stayed. It pooled in the corners. It rose up out of the packed dirt floor and crawled along the base of the walls and lay down beside the bed like a patient animal that had all the time in the world. Marin had done everything she knew to do. She had stuffed the worst of the gaps with dead grass. She had hung a thin blanket over the crooked door to break the draft. She had built the fire as high as their small store of wood would dare to allow. And still, by morning, frost had crept across the inside of the very blanket they slept beneath. A pale, sickly white, like breath, turned solid. Posey slept pressed tight against her mother's chest, her small feet tucked up beneath the hem of Marin's coat, where there was the faintest warmth to be borrowed. Asa lay on the other side, his back straight, his jaw set. He was pretending he was not cold. He was 11 years old, and he had decided, somewhere in the dark, that a man did not let his mother hear him shiver. But Marin could hear his teeth all the same, a soft, helpless clicking he could not stop, no matter how still he held himself. She lay awake between her 2 children and listened to the wind scrape across the broken roof above them. And somewhere in the deepest hollow of that first long night, a small and terrible voice rose up inside her. Maybe the train would have been kinder. Maybe a wiser woman would have taken his money and gone. She closed her eyes against the voice. She did not silence it. She simply refused to obey it. And when the gray light finally bled through the seams of the door, she rose and she wrapped her cracked hands in rags, and she went back to work. The days fell into a hard and simple rhythm. By daylight, Marin climbed onto the sagging roof and pressed wet sod and torn burlap into the worst of the holes, weighting each patch down with whatever stones she could carry. Her fingers split and bled in the cold. She bound them and kept on. Asa packed dry grass into the seams around the door, working without a word. Posey gathered twigs and bits of root for the hearth, carrying them back one small armful at a time, prouder of each load than the last. Water came from the half-frozen creek, half a mile down the slope of the draw. By the time Marin hauled the heavy buckets back up the hill, thin ice had already formed around the rims, and her shoulders burned like fire. The strange thing was, none of it seemed to make the cabin warmer. The fire would blaze, the heat would rise, and then it would simply disappear, swallowed up into the dirt walls and the broken roof and the bitter waiting air. Every armful of precious wood seemed to buy them almost nothing at all. Almost. Because there was one thing the cold could not seem to take. The long stone bench beside the hearth stayed warm. Marin first noticed it on the third night. The fire had burned down to a bed of dull red coals. The rest of the room had gone cold as the bottom of a well. But when she rested her aching hand against the stone bench, it was warm, not hot, not even very warm, just faintly, stubbornly warm. Long after the flames had died, she told herself she had imagined it, a tired woman's mind playing tricks. But on the fourth night, she checked again, and again the stone held its heat, while everything else in the cabin surrendered to the dark. Lying awake beside her children, Marin stared at that long, pale bench, and a new thought began to take shape in her, slow and quiet. Not maybe Garrick was right, but something stranger. Maybe someone built this place to do exactly this. The thought frightened her almost more than the cold did. Because if someone had built it, if someone had once knelt in this very dirt and planned for the warmth to live inside that stone, then someone had once believed that this buried, broken pit was a place where a family could survive. And that meant survival was possible. It only meant she did not yet know how. The wind changed sometime after midnight. It came down out of the north in sudden, violent gusts, hard enough to shake loose dirt from the ceiling beams and rattle the blanket over the door. And then, all at once, the fire turned against them. Smoke rolled backward down the flue in a thick black wave. It poured low across the cabin, filling the small room, stinging eyes, clawing at throats, blotting out the lamp. Asa doubled over, coughing so hard it bent him to his knees. Posey screamed and dove beneath the blanket. Marin dropped down beside the hearth and dragged the burning wood apart with the poker, fighting to choke the smoke without killing the only warmth they had left. And in the middle of all that coughing and panic and rolling dark, she heard something. A sound that did not belong to the hearth. A hollow sound, deep, coming from beneath the floor, from one of the flat stones beside the long, warm bench. Marin went still. The smoke burned in her chest. The children gasped behind her. The wind screamed across the broken roof. And the stone beneath her bleeding hand seemed to answer it. Not a voice. Nothing so simple as that, but a hollowness, a space, as if the earth beneath that one flat slab were not solid at all. She did not sleep the rest of that night. When the smoke had finally thinned and the children had cried themselves into an exhausted, ragged sleep, Marin crouched beside that flat stone with the failing lamp held close. She found an old pry bar leaning in the corner, half-eaten by rust. Left behind, she supposed, by whoever had come before her, by whoever had not seen the spring. She worked the iron edge beneath the stone. At first, nothing. The slab held fast as though it had been a part of the bones of the earth for 100 winters. She set her boot against the bench, and she leaned her whole weight against the bar, and she pushed until her vision blurred. And then, with a deep, grinding scrape, that ran straight up her arms. The stone moved. Cold air rose up out of the dark beneath it, but not the freezing wind from outside. This was different. Dry air, still air, air that smelled of old worked stone and nothing rotten at all. She shoved harder until the slab slid far enough aside to show what lay below. A black iron ring set flush into the floor. Maren stared at it for a very long time. Her breath fogged white in the lamplight. And kneeling there in the dark, with her sleeping children behind her and the dead winter all around, she understood something that made the small hairs rise along her arms. Someone had built this place, knowing the winter would one day come for whoever lived inside it. Someone had planned for this exact night. The iron hatch fought her for every inch. The rust groaned around its edges. She pulled with both torn hands until the old seal finally cracked loose, and a slow, steady breath of air drifted up out of the black below. It was not the smell she had braced herself for. No rot, no mold, no wet, heavy stink of dead earth. Only cool, dry, patient air, like the inside of deep stone that the weather had never been permitted to touch. Maren turned up the lamp and lowered herself down through the narrow opening. Above her, Asa appeared at the lip of the hatch, woken by the noise, his eyes huge and frightened in the smoky dark. "Stay with your sister," she told him softly. "Stay right there. I'll be just below you." And then she descended into the chamber beneath the cabin. It was round. The walls were lined with flat, fitted stone, darkened by age, but dry as old bone. A long stone bench curved along one side, a twin to the one above. Several grain barrels had collapsed inward long ago, their wood split and gray and silent. And there, near the curve of the bench, rested a leather-wrapped notebook, thick with the dust of years. Maren did not reach for it right away. She lifted the lamp instead and turned slowly and studied the walls. Strange black markings spread across the stone, charcoal lines, rough little drawings, and low along the floor she saw the dark, narrow mouths of tunnels, vanishing away into the earth beneath the cabin, like the burrows of some great, careful animal. The place did not feel abandoned. It felt kept, preserved, as though it had only been waiting, all this while, for someone to come back and remember how it worked. She held her cracked palm near one of the tunnel mouths. Even down here, deep beneath the frozen ground, the air moved dry against her skin. And that was the moment the truth first settled, quiet and certain, into Maren's bones. This was no ordinary root cellar. Someone had built this place on purpose, with great care and greater knowledge, to outlast the killing cold. The notebook had belonged to a man named Josiah Crane. His name was written on the first page in a rough, slanting hand, and below it, page after page of cramped, careful words, not the fine script of a schooled man, but the hard, plain letters of someone who had spent too many winters watching the cold take people who had not understood it in time. There was no fine language, no grand ideas, only short, blunt lessons, set down so they would not die with him. Maren read them slowly by the trembling light, while the wind moved somewhere far above the buried roof. Cold kills the wet man first. Stone keeps what the fire leaves behind. A low house lives where a tall one dies. Dry earth is warmer than frozen pride. She read each line twice. Josiah Crane had not written about defeating the winter. He had written about outlasting it. He described the cabin the way a man might describe the den an animal digs down into the earth. A shelter built to lie still and hold its heat while the storm wore itself out, far above. The hearth had been set against the long stone bench on purpose, he wrote, so the warmth would sink down into the rock and remain there, slow and steady, long after the flames had folded into ash. The cellar below kept the air dry. The narrow tunnels pulled the cold draft low, beneath the floor, instead of letting the wind tear straight through the room where people lay down to sleep. And where the draft entered beneath the bench, the old man had set a small wooden slide, a little gate a person could ease open or closed with one hand to feed the low passage more air, or starve it as the wind demanded. Even the walls had their reasons. The hollow spaces inside them, packed with old ash, held still air far better than any solid timber ever could. Marin turned the pages with a growing wonder she had not felt in a very long time. She had walked into this place certain it was a ruin. It was not a ruin. It was a kind of machine, a patient, sleeping machine. And somewhere across the long years, it had simply been allowed to fall asleep too deeply to wake on its own. And then she reached a line, written darker than all the rest, pressed hard into the page, as though the old man's hand had borne down with the full weight of his warning. Never let the north trench close. A buried trench makes the house breathe backward. Smoke will finish what the cold begins. Marin stopped. Slowly, very slowly, she raised the lamp toward the north side of the cabin above her, toward the wall that had nearly vanished beneath packed dirt and dead roots and old hardened drift, the wall that was buried. Her heart turned over heavily in her chest, and the truth arrived all at once, complete and terrible. The cabin had not failed. It had been suffocating, slowly, for years. The smoke that had nearly choked her children was not the fault of a broken house. It was the cry of a buried one, a house breathing backward, exactly as the old man had warned. She climbed back up into the cold gray dawn, with the notebook held against her chest, like something holy. Asa was waiting for her. He had not slept. He had not left his sister's side. "What's down there?" he asked. His voice was very small. Marin knelt down in front of him so their eyes were level. "Help," she said quietly. "There's help down there, Asa. A man left us help." She showed him the notebook. She showed him the dark line about the North Trench, and she watched her son read it twice, his lips moving silently over the words. Then she watched him turn and look toward the buried north wall. For just a moment, the doubt in his young face cracked open, and something else flickered through behind it. Something fragile, something like hope. "A man really lived here," he said. "Through the winter, a man built this," Marin answered. "And we are going to wake it back up. You and me and your sister. Together." Asa looked at the buried wall for a long, long moment. Then he nodded. It was not much, but it was enough to begin. They started to dig before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. The ground fought them for every inch. The frozen dirt rang under the shovel blade like brittle stone. Again and again the steel bounced back, hard enough to jar Marin's shoulders numb to the elbow. The wind came down the draw in sideways bursts, filling the half-dug trench almost as fast as they could clear it. Posey helped the only way a girl of 7 could. She carried away the loose dirt in a battered tin pail, one small load at a time, her round cheeks gone raw and red in the wind, never once complaining. By midday, the rags on Marin's hands had soaked through with blood. Asa's gloves had torn open across the palms. Still, they dug, and in the long blue cold of the afternoon, the shovel suddenly punched through into empty space. Marin dropped to her knees and clawed the frozen earth aside with her bare hands until a narrow, stone-lined tunnel opened beneath them. She held her palm over the opening. Cold air moved against her skin, not the scattered, tearing gusts that ripped across the surface of the draft, low and steady, pulling in one true direction, exactly the way Josiah Crane had written that it should. For the first time since the door had locked behind her, Marin felt her heart truly lift. She looked at her son, and Asa, kneeling in the frozen dirt with his torn hands and his red face, looked back at her, and almost smiled. That night, they lit the fire with great care. For a while, the smoke climbed cleaner than it had since they came. Asa watched it rise straight and gray up the flue, and the hope crept back into his eyes, and then the wind shifted, and the smoke rolled back down in a slow, dark, twisting wave, not as badly as before, but enough to set them all coughing again into their sleeves. The cabin breathed wrong, still, like a wounded thing trying to draw air through a lung only half healed. Asa stared into the weak, struggling fire for a long while. "Do you think he made it?" he asked at last, quietly. "The old man, do you think he really stayed alive in here, all by himself?" Marin did not answer right away. She was reading by the dim light of the coals, and she was beginning to understand that most of what Josiah Crane had written was not about fire at all. It was about air. "Fire warms a man fast," the old hand had written, "but still air keeps him alive slow." The next morning, she and Asa pried loose several warped boards along the inside of the wall, and behind them they found narrow, hollow spaces packed full of old gray ash that had settled down over the years like dead powder. At last, Marin understood what the man had built. Not thick walls, still walls, walls full of trapped, silent air, holding the warmth the way a heavy quilt holds the heat of a sleeping body. By afternoon, all three of them were working as one. Marin hauled buckets of red clay up from the creek bank. Asa chopped dry grass into short, stiff fibers with a worn knife. Posey sat by the hearth, stuffing soft cattail fluff into little burlap sacks, plugging the lowest gaps along the floor where the cold crept in. Ash from the hearth went back into the walls. Clay sealed the cracks between the stones. Grass trapped the still air in the layers between. And slowly, the cabin began to feel like less of a grave. It began to feel like a place where a family lived. But the work had not yet taught Marin its hardest lesson. That lesson came on a night she let herself grow careless. One corner of the east wall had been patched with clay still too wet. She knew it when she pressed her thumb against it that evening, knew it gave too soft, knew it needed another full day to cure before the cold found it. But her hands ached down to the bone. The light was nearly gone. The children were already shivering, and there was supper to manage and a fire to feed. So she left it, just that once. She told herself it would hold until morning. She would learn how dangerous a thing that small lie could be. Deep in the night, it was Asa who woke first. He sat up in the dark, and something made him reach out and lay his hand against the wall beside his bed. It was wet. He pulled his fingers back, confused, and in the faint orange glow of the dying coals, he saw it. Ice, not on the outside of the cabin, where ice belonged. On the inside, pale silver veins of frost spreading across the boards where the wet clay had frozen solid in the cold. "Mama," he whispered. Myron came awake all at once. She crossed the small room and pressed her fingers to the frozen wall, and her stomach dropped away into nothing. The damp had betrayed them. The moisture trapped inside that wet clay had frozen against the wood, turning her one careless seam into a creeping sheet of ice in the dark. She stood there a long time, staring at those silver veins, while Posey slept on, untroubled, beside the warm stone bench. And the truth settled into her, cold and clear and final. It was never the cold alone that killed people out in country like this. It was the wet, the damp that crept into a wall, into a blanket, into a sleeping child's coat, one careless seam, one lazy hour, one small lie a tired woman told herself, to put off the hard work until the morning that, for some, never came. That was all it would take. Cold kills the wet man first. Josiah Crane had written it on the very first page of his book, and now Marin understood, in her own aching bones, exactly what the old man had meant. She scraped the frozen clay out before dawn, on her knees, in the dark, with her bleeding hands, and she packed the seam again the right way this time, dry ash and grass first, the clay laid thin and patient over the top. She did not let herself mourn the lost sleep. The cabin had taught her something, and she meant to carry it the rest of the winter. But the days that followed were not only labor and lessons, they were also Asa, and Asa was slipping away from her. She saw it first in small things. The boy who had read the notebook with hope flickering behind his eyes had gone quiet once more. He still worked. He still chopped the grass and hauled the dirt and packed the walls beside her. But the light had gone out of him again, like a coal raked away from the fire. At night, he lay with his back turned to the room, and he asked no more questions. And one evening, Marin came in from the creek and found him sitting close to the lamp with a stub of charcoal and a torn scrap of paper, writing something he did not want her to see. He folded it quickly the moment he heard her at the door. "What's that?" she asked gently. "Nothing," he said. He tucked it deep into his coat, and he would not lift his eyes to meet hers. Marin did not press him, but that night, lying awake, she turned over the shape of the few words she had glimpsed before he hid them away. She thought she had seen a name written across the top of the page, Uncle Garrick, and her heart ached in a place the cold had never once managed to reach. Because she understood what the letter meant. Her son, her brave, stubborn, frightened boy, had begun to build himself an escape, a door out of this buried place in case his mother failed him, a warm hand to reach for in a warm house far away when his mother's cracked and bleeding hands were not enough. He had begun, quietly, to stop believing in her. She did not blame him for it. He was 11 years old. He was cold and tired and afraid. And a powerful man in a warm and well-lit house had looked him in the eye and told him, with terrible gentleness, that his mother was a fool. But it broke something in her all the same. Posey, though. Posey had found a faith all her own. Every single night, before sleep took her, the little girl would crawl to the far end of the long stone bench and press both of her small palms flat against the rock. The first few nights, she did it only because she was cold, but it had grown into something more than that now. It had become a ritual, a small and solemn act of trust. She would lay her hands against the stone and feel the warmth that lingered there long after the fire had gone dark, and a quiet peace would smooth itself across her round face. "It's still warm, Mama," she would whisper, every night, the same words. Even when the fire's all gone, it's still warm. And Marin, watching her daughter's small hands resting on the stone, would feel something steady itself inside her own chest. The boy was building a way out. The girl was learning to trust in a warmth she could not see. And the widow stood between her two children, holding them both, while the winter pressed down harder on the buried roof above their heads. It was Della Mott who reminded Marin she was not entirely alone in the world. The older woman came up the draw one gray morning, walking the long, cold road from town with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth balanced on her hip. She did not announce herself with any grand speech. She simply set the bundle down inside the door. A sack of dried beans, a small crock of lard, a folded length of heavy wool, thick enough to turn a real wind. And then she looked around the cabin with her tired, knowing eyes. She saw the fresh clay packed into the seams. She saw the still walls and the open trench and the small, steady, careful fire. And something shifted across the old woman's face, a surprise she did not bother to hide. "Well," Della said softly, "will you look at that?" She crossed to the long bench and rested one weathered hand against the stone. The very way Marin herself had done, that first astonished night. Her gray eyebrows rose. "This place has been dead for years," she murmured. "Folks said it killed a grown man. Said the ground out here just won't ever let go of the cold once it sinks in." She turned and looked at Marin. "But this," she said, "this isn't dead." Marin did not boast, nor try to explain the cellar or the notebook or the old man's tunnels running beneath the floor. She only said, "It was never dead. It was just left alone too long. It only needed someone to learn how to listen to it." Della studied her for a long, quiet moment. Then she nodded slowly, as if some private question she had carried up the draw had finally been answered to her satisfaction. Before she left, the old woman paused in the doorway, and the wind tugged at the edges of her shawl. "There's talk in town," she said, more quietly now. "Folks who've lived here their whole lives. They say the cold's going to come down hard this season. Harder than anyone living can rightly remember." She glanced back toward the buried north wall. "You keep that fire low. You keep that trench open. You do exactly what you're doing now." Her old eyes found Marin's. "You hear me, child?" Marin met her gaze and held it. "I hear you." Della nodded once more. And then she walked back down into the gray morning, leaving behind a little more food than they'd had before, and a great deal more than food. That night, the fire behaved better than it had since they first walked through the crooked door. The smoke climbed cleaner, the draft pulled true and low, and the long stone bench held its warmth deep into the dark, long after the last small flame had folded itself down into glowing coals. Posey pressed her hands against the rock and smiled in her sleep. Asa lay with his back to the room, the folded letter still hidden in his coat, his trust still half a step out the door, and Marin sat awake between her two children, the notebook open across her knees, reading the rough, slanted words of a man long gone. A man who had built a den against the cold with his own hands, and then, somehow, been forgotten by everyone but the winter. She traced one line with her cracked finger. Stone keeps what fire leaves behind. Outside, the wind moved through the draw with a low and hollow voice. It did not sound like the cry of an animal anymore. It sounded like something testing the walls, searching slowly, patiently, for the one small gap a tired woman might have left behind in the dark. Marin closed the notebook. She rested her own hand against the warm stone beside her sleeping daughter's small one, and she made the buried cabin a silent promise. You will not bury my children, not while there is breath in me to keep you breathing too. She did not yet know how cruelly that promise was about to be tested. She did not yet know that the cold the old woman had warned of was already gathering, far out beyond the ridge in the dark, or that it would come down the draw carrying with it the very man who had locked the door behind her. But the stone was warm beneath her hand. The trench lay open. The walls stood still. And for tonight, that was enough to face the dark. The tunnel was barely wide enough for a grown woman's shoulders. Marin knew that before she ever knelt down at its dark mouth. She had measured it with her eyes the day they cleared the trench, and she had told herself then that she would never have to go inside. But the fire still breathed wrong. It pulled clean for an hour, sometimes two, and then the draft would falter, and the smoke would sag back down into the room, and she would know, somewhere below the floor, the old man's careful passage was choking on something. So one cold morning, she tied a length of rope around her waist. She knotted it twice. She tested it hard, and she put the other end into Asa's two hands. If I pull twice, she told him, you pull me back, as hard as you can. You don't ask me anything. You don't wait. You just pull. Do you understand? Asa looked down at the rope in his fists. Then he looked at the black hole in the floor that his mother was about to disappear into. Why can't I go? He said. I'm smaller. I'd fit easier. Because if it comes down, Marin said quietly, I need you out here. I need you holding this rope. That's the most important place there is. It was the truth. But it was also the kindest lie a mother could tell a frightened boy. That the safe job was the brave one. Asa's jaw tightened. He gripped the rope until his knuckles went white. Twice, he said. You pull twice, and I pull you out. That's right. And then Marin took the lamp in one hand, and she lay down on her belly in the cold dirt, and she pushed herself forward into the dark beneath the cabin. The earth pressed in on every side. The packed dirt dragged at her coat. The cold stone walls scraped along her shoulders. The lamp threw a small, trembling circle of light just ahead of her face, and beyond that circle there was nothing at all. She could not lift her head. She could barely lift her chest. She moved the way a snake moves, by inches, by elbows, by will alone. And the deeper she crawled, the more damage the little light revealed. Clay seals between the old stones had cracked clean apart. One whole stretch of the draft passage was packed solid with dry grass and the ruins of mouse nests, jammed in so tight the air could barely whisper through. This was the wound. This was where the house had been slowly strangling itself all these long forgotten years. Marin reached the blockage and began to claw it loose with her bare fingers, dragging the packed grass back past her own body, fistful by fistful, in a space too narrow to turn around in. The dust filled her throat. The cold ate into her chest. And then, somewhere behind her, she felt the rope catch. She pushed forward to free more of the blockage, and the rope held her fast. It had snagged on something, a jut of broken stone, a root. She could not see it. She could not reach it. She was wedged in the dark beneath the frozen earth, with her arms pinned ahead of her and the cold pressing down on her back like a slow and patient hand. For one terrible moment, the old story rose up in her mind. The man they had found froze through, sitting up beside his own cold hearth. Maybe this was how the dark took a person, not all at once, but inch by inch, in a place too narrow to turn around in. Her breath came short and quick, and then she heard him. "Mama." Asa's voice, small and tight, traveled down the tunnel to her. "Mama, the rope stopped moving. Are you stuck? Mama, answer me." Maren closed her eyes. She made herself breathe slow, and she did not pull twice. Not yet. Because if he pulled her back now, the blockage would still be there, and the house would still be strangling, and they would have to do all of this again. "I'm all right," she called back, and she fought to keep her voice steady. "The rope's caught on something behind me. Don't pull. Listen to me, Asa. Go slack. Let it loose, just for a moment." A silence. She could feel him deciding. "Trust me," she said into the dark. "Let it go slack." The tension on the rope eased, and Maren reached back along her own hip, found the taut line, and worked it gently free of whatever stone had caught it. Then she pulled herself forward again, and the rope came with her, and her chest unlocked, and the cold lost its grip. "It's free," she called. "I'm free. Hold steady now." She cleared the rest of the blockage in a kind of fury, dragging it past her, breaking it loose, until at last she felt the air change. A breath of cold draft moved against her face, low, steady, pulling true. The wound was open. The house could breathe again. When she finally backed her way out of the tunnel and rose, filthy and shaking, into the gray light of the cabin, Asa was still standing exactly where she had left him. His hands were locked around the rope. His face was streaked where he had been crying, and trying not to. He did not say a word. He just dropped the rope and crossed the room and pressed his face hard against his mother's dirty coat. And Maren held her son in the cold and felt the small crack of trust she had thought she'd lost begin, very quietly, to mend. That night, the fire climbed clean and true for the first time since they had come. No backdraft, no sagging smoke. The flames stood straight, and the warmth sank down into the long stone bench, and the bench gave it back slow into the dark. Posy laid her hands against the rock and smiled. "It's still warm, Mama." "I know, baby," Maren said. "I know it is." But Asa sat a little apart from them, near the lamp. And though he had wept into her coat that very afternoon, though he had held that rope as if his mother's life depended on it, which it had, Maren saw that his hand kept drifting to the front of his coat, to the place where the folded letter still hid. The boy's heart was at war. One half of him had begun to believe in his mother again. The other half still kept a hand on the door, and neither half yet knew which way it would fall. The man came 3 days after that, a rider far out on the ridge trail, dark against the pale sky. Maren saw him before he saw her. She was outside, smearing clay between two cracked boards with her bare hands, and Asa was breaking stone with a hammer almost too heavy for his arms, and Posey was stuffing grass into the lower gaps along the wall. And then the hoof beats came down the draw, and Garrett Kincaid rode into the bottom of the hollow, sitting tall in the saddle, his coat clean, his boots still polished, even with all that mud below him. He drew up his horse, and for a long moment he said nothing. He simply looked at the buried cabin, at the sagging roof, at the woman on her knees with her hands black to the wrist, and the boy with the heavy hammer, and the little girl in the cold. And then he laughed, once, soft and low, under his breath. "My God," he said quietly, "you're burying those children alive." Maren did not stop working. That seemed to irritate him more than any argument could have. "A woman who knows she's beaten," he went on, "takes her family somewhere warm before the snow seals the whole country shut." His eyes traveled across the half-buried walls. "This isn't a home. It's a hole in the ground with a roof on it. It's a grave that hasn't finished yet." Posey went very still. Asa lowered the hammer slowly into the dirt, and Maren rose to her feet at last, wiping her ruined hands against her apron, and faced him. "Then why did you ride all the way out here, Garrick?" she asked. "If it's a grave, if we're already finished, why come all this way to tell us so?" Something flickered across his face, just for an instant, and it was not the cruelty she had braced herself for. It was something older, something raw. "Because I made a promise," Garrick said. His voice had changed. The smoothness had gone out of it. "To my brother, at the end, when there was nothing left of him but his eyes and his breath." He looked away toward the gray ridge. He took my hand. He could barely speak. "And he asked me to look after you, to look after his children." The wind moved through the draw between them. "I gave him my word," Garrick said, "and I have watched you drag those two babies out into the worst country in the territory, into a pit that has already killed one man, and I cannot keep my word and let you do it." And there it was. Maren saw it whole now. The thing that had been hiding underneath all his cold and all his contempt. It was not greed for the farm. It was grief. It was a man who had stood at his brother's deathbed and made a promise he did not know how to keep, and had decided somewhere in his own breaking heart that keeping it meant tearing this family apart for their own good. He had not been able to save his brother, so he had made up his mind to save the children, even if he had to break them to do it. "You think this is mercy?" Maren said softly. "Taking everything we have, locking the door, sending us off into the snow with a handful of money. You've told yourself that's love." "It is the only love I have left to give," Garrick said, and for the first time his voice nearly broke. Then he steadied himself, and he turned his eyes to the boy. "Send Asa with me," he said, "at least the boy. He doesn't have to die out here to prove a point. Let me take him somewhere warm, somewhere safe. You can keep the girl close, but give me the boy." The whole draw went silent. Maren did not answer, because it was not her answer to give. Slowly, every eye turned to Asa. The boy stood with the hammer at his feet and his hand pressed flat against the front of his coat, against the letter, against the escape he had been carrying in secret all these long, cold weeks, the door he had kept open behind him, The warm hand he had reached for, in the dark, when he had stopped believing his mother could keep them alive. Here was the door, swung wide. A warm house, a clean bed. An end to the cold and the bleeding hands and the smoke. All he had to do was walk to the horse. Garrick held out one gloved hand. "Come on, son," he said gently. "There's no shame in it. You've been brave enough." Asa looked at the hand. He looked at the warm coat and the clean boots and the way out he had wanted so badly. And then he looked at his mother, at her ruined hands, at the clay caked to her wrists, at the buried cabin she had pulled back from the dead with nothing but a dead man's notebook and her own refusal to quit. And Maren watched her son reach into his coat. She watched him draw out the folded scrap of paper, the letter, the one with Uncle Garrick written across the top, and she held her breath. Asa unfolded it. He looked down at his own charcoal words for a long moment, and then he tore it, once, twice, into small pale pieces that the wind plucked from his fingers and scattered across the frozen draw. "I'm staying," he said. His voice shook, but it did not break. "My mother knows how to keep us alive. An old man left us how, and we're going to make it, all three of us." The scraps of the letter tumbled away across the snow. Garrick lowered his hand. For a long moment he simply sat there in the saddle, looking at the boy and at the woman, and at the buried house that had somehow taught them both something he did not understand. Then, without another word, he turned his horse and rode back up the ridge trail. Long after the sound of the hoof beats had faded, Asa stood staring at the empty trail. Maren came and stood beside him. She did not say anything about the letter. She did not need to. She only put her arm around her son's shoulders and felt him lean into her. And the two of them watched the ridge until the light began to go. "Mama," Asa said at last, very quietly, "was Uncle Garrick lying? About Papa? About the promise?" Maren thought about it for a long moment. "No," she said, "I don't think he was." "Then why is he so cruel?" She let out a slow breath that fogged in the cold. "Because grief makes some people gentle," she said, "and it makes others hard. Your uncle loved your father. He just doesn't know what to do with all that love now that your father's gone. So it comes out crooked. It comes out as control, as certainty, as cruelty, he tells himself, is kindness." She squeezed his shoulder. "That's a thing to remember, Asa. When someone is hardest on you, sometimes it's because they're carrying something they don't know how to put down." Asa was quiet for a while. "I almost went with him," he admitted. "I know, but I didn't." "I know that too." She pressed her lips to the top of his cold head. "And I will be grateful for it every day I live." That was the last gentle evening they would have for some time, because the very next morning, the old rancher came down the draw. Hollis Dorn was a weathered man with a gray beard and eyes the color of old ice, and he had lived in that country longer than anyone could remember. He rode up slow, and he sat looking at the buried cabin for a while, the same way Della had, the same way Garrick had, but with something different behind it. Not contempt, not pity, a kind of grudging, narrow-eyed respect. "Smoke off your chimney's been thin," he said by way of greeting. "Thin and low. Most folks out here are burning twice the wood you are this time of year and freezing anyway." He climbed down stiffly from his horse and walked to the door. Marin let him in. He stood in the still, dry air of the cabin, and he took off one glove, and he laid his bare hand against the long stone bench. His eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "That heat didn't come from a fresh fire," he said slowly. "That's been sitting in the rock, stored." He looked at the small, careful flames in the hearth, then around at the packed walls. "I've been 40 winters in this country, and I've never set foot in a shack that holds its warmth like this one." He looked at Marin with new eyes. "Who taught you to build like this?" "A man who's gone now," she said simply. "He left his book behind." Hollis grunted, as though that answer satisfied something in him. Then his weathered face changed. He walked to the doorway and looked out, up at the sky, and the lines around his old eyes deepened. "You'll want to listen to me now," he said, "because what I came to tell you matters more than any of the rest." He set 3 things down by the door as he spoke: a strip of cured meat, a small sack of dried onions, and an old brass instrument on a cracked leather strap, the kind that measured the weight of the air, its needle trembling behind clouded glass. "That glass started falling fast this morning," Hollis said. "Faster than I've seen it fall in years. The animals know it already. The cattle are standing with their backs to the north, and the birds are flying low to the ground." He looked at her hard. "There's something coming down off the high country. Something mean. The old folks have a name for the worst of these. But I won't trouble you with it. Just know this. When it comes, it will come all at once, and it will not care how brave you are." Marin looked at the trembling needle behind the glass. "How long?" she asked. "Day, maybe less." Hollis pulled his glove back on. "You keep that fire small and that stone warm, missus. Don't go chasing heat with a big blaze when it hits. A big fire just throws its warmth up the flue and out into the storm. Your stone there, that's worth more than a cord of wood." It was exactly what the old notebook had said. A big fire wastes what stone would keep. 2 different men, one living, one long dead, saying the same true thing across all the years between them. Hollis mounted up. He looked once more at the thin ribbon of smoke rising low off the buried roof. "Strange little place," he muttered. "It don't look like much." Then he almost smiled. "But I believe it might just hold." And he rode away up the draw. Marin did not waste the warning. All that day, she worked like a woman possessed. She hauled water up from the creek until her shoulders screamed and the buckets filled the cellar. She carried the grain sacks down out of the cold. She packed dry ash and folded burlap into every low gap around the door, every seam where the wind might find a way in. She trimmed the fire down small and steady, and fed it slow, and watched the warmth sink patiently into the stone. Asa worked beside her without being asked. Posey carried what she could, and as the afternoon wore on toward dusk, the boy paused, leaning on his hammer, and looked at his mother. "Why are we letting the fire get so small?" he asked. "If a storm's coming, shouldn't we build it up? Make it as hot as we can?" Marin pushed another stick carefully into the coals. "Big fires waste heat," she said. "The stone keeps it. The old man knew that. So did Hollis. The fire that roars all night burns out the wood and warms the sky." She rested her hand on the bench. "But the fire that sits low and quiet, it teaches the stone to remember." And the stone holds on long after the flame is gone. Asa nodded slowly, looking at the small, steady flames. Low and quiet, he repeated. Low and quiet, she agreed. Same as us. Then, near dusk, the strangest thing of all happened. The wind stopped. Not slowly, not gradually, all at once. The constant low voice that had moved through the draw since the day they arrived, the testing, searching, hollow sound that had become as familiar as their own breathing, simply ceased. And a silence fell over the whole hollow, a silence so complete it pressed against the ears. Marin stepped to the doorway and looked out. The land had gone pale. The sky had drained of all its color until the whole world looked as though it had been cut from dull, soft lead. Nothing moved, not a blade of dead grass, not a single bird. The draw held its breath, and the silence went on. For 1 hour, then 2, then nearly 3. Marin had never heard anything so loud in all her life. She understood it now. The thing the old woman had warned of, and the old rancher, and the dead man in his book. This was the air pulling itself back, the way the sea is said to pull back from the shore before it returns as a wall of water. Something was gathering itself out beyond the ridge. Something patient. Something enormous. And it was holding still, just for a moment, the way a great animal holds still before it springs. Marin stood in the doorway of the buried cabin and watched the pale, waiting sky. Behind her, the fire burned low and quiet. The stone held its warmth. The walls stood still and dry, and the trench lay open, and her 2 children slept close beside the bench where the heat lingered in the rock. She had done everything the old man had written. She had done everything the 2 old strangers had told her. There was nothing left to do now but wait and find out whether a dead man named Josiah Crane had truly known what he was talking about, or whether the frost pit was about to bury one more family beneath the snow. The first hard flake touched her cheek, then another. And far out beyond the ridge, in the terrible silence, the storm finally began to move. The storm did not arrive the way Marin had imagined it would. She had braced herself for a slow gathering, for the snow to thicken little by little, for the cold to deepen by degrees, the way bad weather had always come before. But it did not come slow. One moment, the draw lay beneath that terrible pale silence, holding its breath. And the next, the world simply ended. A white wall came down out of the north and struck the hollow like a great hand slamming flat against the earth. The buried cabin shuddered from its roof beams to its floor stones. The wind found its voice all at once, and that voice was no longer a low and searching whisper. It was a roar, a deep, endless freight train roar that filled the whole world and left no room in it for any other sound. The snow no longer fell. It flew, sideways, in solid white sheets that erased everything beyond the door within the space of a single breath. The ridge vanished. The creek vanished. The whole pale waiting land was swallowed whole until there was nothing left in all the world but the small buried room and the howling dark pressing in on every side of it. Posey screamed and dove beneath the heavy wool blanket Della had left them. Asa went stiff and pale, his eyes huge. And Marin stood for one moment in the middle of it, listening to the buried walls groan around her, listening to the storm try to tear the roof from over her children's heads. And then she moved. "It's all right," she said, and her voice did not shake. She had decided, somewhere in that pale silence before, that her voice would not shake, no matter what came. "Listen to me, both of you. The house is built for this. The old man built it for exactly this. The walls will hold." "How do you know?" Asa's voice cracked. "How do you know they'll hold?" Marin knelt down in front of her son and took his cold face in both her ruined hands. "Because a wall that's buried in the earth," she said, "doesn't have to fight the wind. The earth fights it for them. Out there, the storm is breaking itself to pieces against the ground. In here, we're underneath all of that. We're below it. The storm can't reach what it can't get hold of." She made herself smile. "We're not standing against this thing, Asa. We're letting it pass right over the top of us, like water over a stone." The boy searched her face for the lie, and he did not find one, because she meant every word. The buried earth walls held. That was the first great mercy of that long and terrible night. The packed soil around the lower half of the cabin took the worst of the cold and the worst of the wind and held them off, the way a thick coat holds off the rain. The cabin groaned. It shuddered. Dirt sifted down from the ceiling beams with every great gust, but it held. And the small fire burned low and steady in the hearth, just as it should, sending its warmth down patiently into the long stone bench instead of throwing it away up the flue into the teeth of the storm. Marin did not let herself rest. She had learned by then that this house did not survive on its own. It survived because someone tended it, because someone listened to it, because someone caught the small failures before they became the large ones. So she set herself a watch. Every hour, she made the same slow round. She checked the flue for ice. She pressed her hand to the rawhide seal around the cellar hatch, feeling for any cold draft creeping through. She crouched low by the floor cracks beside the stone bench, and she held a candle there, and she watched. If the small flame bent gently inward, drawn down toward the hidden trench beneath the floor, the house was breathing right. If the flame stood straight, or worse, leaned the wrong way, then something, somewhere below, had begun to fail. For the first hours of the storm, the candle flame bent true. The draft moved low and steady beneath the floor. The cellar stayed dry. The stone bench gave its warmth back into the room, slow and faithful, even as the fire settled down to little more than coals. And in the spaces between her rounds, Marin held her children. Posy she gathered close against her chest, the little girl's feet tucked beneath the hem of her coat, her face buried in her mother's shoulder against the roar. Asa she kept on her other side, one arm around him, and though he was 11 and too old, by his own reckoning, to be held like a baby, he did not pull away. Not on that night. "Tell us about Papa," Posy said, her voice muffled against Marin's shoulder. "Tell us a story about Papa, so I don't have to listen to the wind." And so Marin told them stories. She told them about the way their father used to whistle without any tune at all, just for the pleasure of the sound, until it drove her half to distraction. She told them about the time he had tried to surprise her with a cake and burned it black and served it to her anyway, with such pride that she had eaten every bitter bite and told him it was wonderful. She told them small, warm, ordinary things, the kind of things that do not seem like much while a person is living them, but become, after that person is gone, the most precious things in all the world. And slowly, beneath the roar of the storm, the children's fear loosened its grip. Posey's breathing went deep and even. Asa's eyes grew heavy, and Marin sat between her two children in the small buried room, with the storm screaming far above them, and felt something she had not let herself feel in a very long time. Not safety. There was no safety in that night, but something quieter, a kind of peace held in the very middle of the terror. The peace of having done everything that could be done, of having no more decisions left to make, of simply being there with the ones she loved while the worst of the world howled past, unable to reach them. It did not last. It was somewhere in the dead black middle of the night when the trouble came. Marin had just finished her round. The candle had bent true. The fire had burned down low, and she had let herself lean back against the stone bench, just for a moment, just to close her stinging eyes. And then the wind changed. She felt it before she heard it. A shift in the great roar above them, the storm wheeling around, like some vast creature changing the angle of its attack. And then the fire turned on them. A great gust slammed down the flue, and the smoke came with it. Not a slow sag this time, not a thin gray thread, a thick black wave of it, rolling backward down the chimney and pouring out low across the room, blotting out the coals, filling the small space with a choking dark. Posey woke coughing. Asa bolted upright, hacking, his eyes streaming. The candle on the floor guttered. The air turned thick and foul. The house was breathing backward, exactly as the dead man had warned. A buried trench makes the house breathe backward. Smoke will finish what the cold begins. Marin was already moving. "Cut the fire," she said, sharp, fast. No panic in it, only command. "Asa, the poker. Pull the wood apart. Spread the coals out flat. Now." The boy did not freeze. That was the thing Marin would remember, long after that night. The boy did not freeze, and he did not wait to be told twice. He grabbed the poker in both hands and dropped to his knees beside the smoking hearth and dragged the burning wood apart, spreading the coals thin, smothering the flame down toward nothing, exactly as she had asked. And Marin threw herself toward the floor cracks by the bench. She reached for the small wooden slide the old man had built there, the little gate that opened and closed the draft beneath the floor. Her fingers found it in the dark, in the choking smoke, and she worked it, easing it, adjusting it, opening the low passage wider to give the backed-up air somewhere to go. For 10 seconds, nothing changed. The smoke hung thick across the ceiling. Posey was crying into the blanket. The roar of the storm went on and on above them. 10 seconds felt like 10 years, and then the candle flame, guttering on the floor, slowly straightened, and then it bent, inward, downward, toward the trench. True, the draft caught. The low passage pulled, and all at once, the thick black smoke began to lift, drawn up and out, the way it was meant to go. The air cleared. The hearth drew clean again. The house had corrected itself. Marin sat back on her heels in the clearing smoke, breathing hard, her heart slamming against her ribs. And beside her, Asa stared at the candle flame, at the way it bent so gently toward the hidden trench beneath the floor, at the house, breathing again, all on its own. Mama, he whispered. His voice was full of something close to awe. It fixed itself. It just fixed itself. No, Marin said softly, when she had caught her breath. It didn't fix itself, baby. We helped it. You and me. We did exactly what the old man left us to do, and the house did the rest. She looked at the bending flame. That's how it works. It can't save us all on its own, and we can't save ourselves without it. We do our part, and it does its part. And together, she reached out and laid her hand on the warm stone bench. Together, we breathe. Asa looked at the flame a long moment. Then he looked at his mother, and something in his face had changed for good. It's breathing, he said quietly. Mama, listen, it's really breathing. And it was. Beneath the roar of the storm, if a person grew very still and listened with their whole heart, there was another sound. A slow, low, steady draw and release. The draft pulling and easing through the hidden passages beneath the floor. The buried house, breathing in the dark, like a living thing, like something that had been asleep for a very long time and had finally, fully woken up. After that, the boy did not sleep, but it was a different kind of not sleeping than before. He did not lie stiff with fear, his hand on the front of his coat where the letter used to be. He sat up beside his mother, near the warm stone, and he watched her tend the house, and he asked her to teach him. So she taught him. She showed him how to read the candle flame. She showed him how to feel the rawhide seal for the smallest creeping draft. She showed him how to listen to the storm above and tell, just by the change in its voice, when the wind was about to wheel around and try the flue again. And the next time it did, it was Asa who caught it. It was Asa who said, Mama, the wind's turning. I can hear it. Before the smoke ever started to sag. It was Asa who reached for the poker, and Marin who reached for the draft gate, and the two of them who eased the house through it together, before it ever had the chance to breathe backward at all. They were a pair now, mother and son, tending the small buried fire through the long black hours, the way the dead man must have once tended it alone. And somewhere in those hours, Asa spoke the thing that had been sitting in his chest since the smoke came down. He was working the draft gate the way she'd taught him, and he did not look up. When the smoke rolled down tonight, he said, I wasn't scared the way I used to be. Marin waited. Before, I used to lie awake thinking about getting out, thinking somebody would come and take us somewhere easy. His jaw worked. But tonight I didn't want out. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to keep us breathing. That's all I wanted. He finally lifted his eyes to her in the low coal light. I think that's the first time I ever felt like I belonged to a place, instead of just waiting to leave it. Marin was quiet for a moment. She did not rush to fill it. She had learned, raising this boy, that some things a child needs to say all the way to the end before anyone answers. That feeling, she said at last, is the most important thing you'll ever learn out here. And you learned it the hard way, the only way that ever truly sticks. She brushed the hair back from his forehead. You were right to want out, Asa. You were only ever wrong about one thing. What thing? You thought that being strong meant fighting. You thought that surviving meant standing up tall against the storm and refusing to bend. She shook her head slowly. But that's not what saves a person out here. The men who stand up tall against a storm like this, they're the ones it kills first. It snaps them like dead branches. She gestured at the buried walls around them, at the low fire, at the warm stone. The old man understood that. He didn't build a place to fight the winter. He built a place to outlast it. Low, dry, patient, quiet. He built a house that bends and ducks and stays still and lets the worst of the world pass right over the top of it. She looked at her son. That's not weakness, Asa. That's the deepest kind of strength there is. It's the strength to not fight when fighting would kill you. It's the strength to wait. Asa thought about that for a long while. Is that what you've been doing? He asked. Since Papa died? Waiting? The question caught her like a hand around the heart. Because it was true, and she had not known, until her own child said it aloud, just how true it was. She had not been fighting her grief. She had not been strong against it, in the way people meant when they told a widow to be strong. She had been waiting it out, living low and quiet beneath the weight of it, letting it pass over her, day by day, the way the storm was passing over the house, not defeating it, just outlasting it, refusing to be broken by it, tending the small fire of her own heart, and trusting that the warmth would last until the morning. Yes, she said softly. I suppose it is. I suppose that's exactly what I've been doing. She pulled her son close against her side. Your papa is gone, Asa, and I can't fight that. I can't be strong enough to bring him back, no matter how I might want to. All I can do is what this house does. Stay low, stay warm inside, hold on to the heat of the good days we had with him, and outlast the cold. She kissed the top of his head. And take care of the two of you, all the way through to spring. Asa was quiet against her, and then he said, very low, We're going to make it, aren't we, Mama? It was not a question anymore. Yes, she said, we are. The storm raged on. It did not weaken. If anything, somewhere in the deepest part of that night, it grew worse, the roar above them rising until it seemed the whole sky had come loose and was tearing itself apart over the buried roof. But inside, the little house kept breathing, and Marin, on her endless rounds, began to understand the full genius of what the dead man had built. The air never became truly warm. That was not what the house was for. It did not promise comfort. It promised only this, that the cold would not be allowed to kill. And there was a difference between those two things. A difference Marin had never understood until that night. Warmth was a luxury. Warmth was for easy seasons, but not freezing. That was survival. That was the whole and only thing that mattered now. And the house gave it to them, hour after hour, faithfully, asking nothing in return but that someone stay awake to listen. She thought about the man who had built it. Josiah Crane, a name in a notebook, a rough, slanting hand, a stranger, long dead, who had knelt in this very dirt and packed these very walls and dug these very tunnels with no way of ever knowing who might come after him. He had not built this place for himself alone. A man building only for himself does not write a book. He does not set down his hard-won lessons in plain words, so they will not die when he dies. He does not leave a notebook resting on a stone bench, where the next desperate soul might find it. Josiah Crane had built this place, and then left instructions, for whoever came next, for a stranger he would never meet, for a widow and 2 children he could never have imagined. He had reached across all the silent years with nothing but charcoal and stone and patience, and he had said, Here is how to live. I learned it the hard way, so that you would not have to. And Maren, kneeling on the cold floor in the middle of that screaming night, felt her eyes sting with something that was not the smoke, because she understood now that she was not alone in this fight after all. She had thought she was. The night the door locked behind her, she had believed herself the most alone a person could be. A widow, cast out, with 2 children and a handful of money, and a whole hostile winter waiting. But she was not alone. A dead man was helping her. An old woman walked the cold road from town to leave food by her door. An old rancher had ridden out to warn her of the storm and left his own brass glass behind. And even her boy, who had wanted so badly to leave. Her boy was beside her now, awake in the dark, tending the fire with his own 2 hands. The world had not abandoned her. It had only made her dig, and dig deep, before it showed her where the help had been buried all along. Toward what must have been the dawn, though no light could reach them, the worst of the storm finally began to break. The roar above did not stop, but it changed. It lost some of its fury. The gusts came farther apart. The deep shudder in the walls eased, little by little, until the cabin only trembled now and then, like a creature settling after a long fright. Posy slept on through it. That was the thing Maren noticed in the gray exhaustion of that hour. The little girl slept deep and easy, curled against the warm stone bench, one small hand resting flat against the rock the way it always did, and her breathing did not shake. On their first nights in this place, Posy's breath had come in small, frightened shudders, her whole body clenched against the cold, even in sleep. Maren had lain awake listening to it, sick with worry, wondering if she had carried her children into a grave after all. But now the child slept the way a child is meant to sleep, soft, deep, untroubled, warm. The cold had not gotten into her. The house had kept its promise. Maren sat back against the bench beside her sleeping daughter, and her son leaned heavy and drowsy against her other side, and for the first time in many long hours, she let herself close her eyes. "It's still warm, Mama," Posy murmured in her sleep, her small hand pressing the stone. She said it without waking, as though even her dreams knew it to be true. "I know, baby," Maren whispered. "I know it is." And the buried house breathed on around them, slow and low and steady, while the great storm spent the last of its fury against the unyielding earth above. It went on for days. Long after that first terrible night had passed, the storm kept the whole world locked in white. The wind would gentle for a few hours, and Maren would let herself hope it was over, and then it would gather itself and return, throwing the snow sideways once more, piling the drifts ever higher against the buried walls. But it was different now. The fear was gone. The family had a rhythm to it, a way of living inside the storm instead of merely surviving it minute to minute. Maren made her rounds. Asa took the watches she had once taken alone and woke her only when the wind began to turn. Posy kept the small tasks, fetching this and folding that, her small face calm. They told stories. They rationed the food Della had left, and the cured meat Hollis had brought, and they made it stretch. They melted snow for water when the creek became impossible to reach. They slept in shifts, and they kept the fire low, and they tended the breathing of the house. And slowly, over those long white days, something settled into all three of them. A quiet confidence, a knowledge earned the hardest way there is that they could do this, that they were not going to die in this place, that the buried cabin and the dead man's wisdom and their own 4 hands were enough, more than enough. One evening, deep in the storm, Asa sat polishing the clouded glass of Hollis Dorn's old brass instrument with his sleeve, watching the trembling needle. "It stopped falling," he said. Marin looked up from the notebook. "What did?" "The glass." Hollis said it was falling fast. That's how he knew the storm was coming. "But look." The boy held it out. "It stopped falling. It's starting to climb." Marin took the old instrument in her hands and looked at the needle behind the glass. He was right. It was rising. Slow, but sure. "What does that mean?" Asa asked. Marin looked toward the door, where the snow still flew sideways in the dark beyond. "It means," she said slowly, "that the worst of it is behind us. The storm's spent itself. It's got nothing left." She set the instrument down gently. "It might howl another day, maybe 2, but it's dying now. We outlasted it, Asa." The boy stared at her. "We outlasted it," he repeated. And then he laughed. It was a small, surprised, disbelieving sound. The laugh of a child who has been afraid for so long that he had nearly forgotten he knew how. It bubbled up out of him before he could stop it, and it woke Posey, who blinked and smiled without knowing why. And then she was laughing too. And Marin, watching her 2 children laugh in the low firelight of a buried house, in the middle of a storm that had killed grown men, felt her own throat tighten with a joy so fierce it was nearly pain. They had done it, not through strength, through patience, through listening, through dirt and ash and stone, and the kindness of strangers living and dead, through staying low and staying warm and refusing, simply refusing to be broken. The storm had come down with everything it had, and the widow and her 2 children were still breathing. On the morning the wind finally stopped for good, Marin sat alone by the hearth while her children slept. The fire had burned down to embers. The house was quiet, and in the new silence she could hear it more clearly than ever before. The slow, low breathing of the draft beneath the floor. In and out, in and out. She rested her hand on the warm stone bench. The fire had been dead nearly an hour. The stone was still warm, and kneeling there in the gray quiet, with the worst behind her, and her children safe, and her own grief settled at last into something she could carry. Marin finally understood the deepest thing the old man had written, the thing she had read a dozen times without truly hearing. The earth never promised comfort, only shelter for those willing to learn its rules. She had not survived this winter by being strong. She had survived it by being patient, by being humble enough to learn from a dead man's book, by being stubborn enough to dig when everyone told her to flee, by staying low and dry and quiet and faithful, while the world howled itself out above her head. But she did not yet know what the storm had done to the world beyond the draw. She did not yet know that while her small house had been breathing in the dark, the town had been freezing. She did not yet know that help, when the snow finally cleared, would come walking toward her buried door from the most unexpected direction of all. For now, there was only the quiet, the warm stone beneath 3 sleeping bodies, and a widow who had walked into a grave the whole world named for her, and made it hold her children through the worst the dark could do. The storm did not so much end as exhaust itself. There came a morning, after 4 long days, when the great roar above the buried roof simply ran out of voice. The wind dropped, the sideways snow slowed and thinned, and finally stopped altogether, and a silence came down over the draw. But it was a different silence than the one before the storm. That earlier silence had been a held breath, full of dread and waiting. This one was the silence of something that had finished, spent, emptied out. Marin rose stiff from beside the hearth and went to the door. It would not open. She pushed, and it gave only an inch, and a wall of packed white pressed back against it. The snow had drifted halfway up the buried cabin in the night, sealing them in beneath it. For a moment, a cold finger of fear touched her heart, but then she remembered the breathing of the house. The draft still moved beneath the floor. The flue still drew clean. Sealed in or not, the air was good. They were not trapped. They were only waiting to be let out. So she dug. She and Asa took the shovel in turns, carving a narrow tunnel up through the drift, up toward the gray light, until at last the blade broke through into open air, and a shaft of cold, clean morning spilled down into the buried dark. Marin climbed up out of it, and she stood, blinking, in a world she did not recognize. The whole draw had vanished beneath the snow, where the creek had run, where the dead grass had stood, where the road had wound down into the hollow. There was nothing now but a smooth white desert of drifts, some of them piled as high as a wagon wheel, gleaming under a pale and washed-out sun. The cold of it hit her lungs like broken glass. It was the kind of cold that follows a great storm, a hard, brilliant, brutal cold, in a world scrubbed clean and silent and strange. Nothing moved, nothing, anywhere, in all that white. And then, far out across the buried ravine, Marin saw something move. At first she thought it a trick of the light, a shadow, a drift shifting in the wind, but it moved again. And then it became many movements, small dark shapes, far out across the snow, struggling forward one slow and painful step at a time. A line of people. Marin shaded her eyes and stared. There were perhaps a dozen of them, strung out in a ragged line across the drifts. And at their head walked a broad, weathered figure with a rope tied around his waist, breaking the trail, hauling the others forward through snow that came up past their knees. Hollis Dorn. Behind him came the others, bundled in coats and blankets, some carrying small children wrapped tight against their chests, some leaning on one another, barely able to lift their feet. And there, near the very back of the line, 2 men were half dragging a third between them. A tall man whose fine wool coat was crusted white with ice. A man who could barely keep his own feet beneath him. Even at that distance, even frozen and stumbling, Marin knew him. Garrick. She had not even known he was in the town, but she understood it now, in a flash. He had left the farm weeks ago. He could not bear to winter alone in his dead brother's empty house, with the chairs his brother had built and the bed his brother had died in. So he had taken rooms in town, among people where it was warm and lit and easy. And when the great stove failed, The easy place had become the deadliest place of all. The very man who had locked the door of a warm house behind her and sent her out into the snow with a handful of money and called her shelter a grave was coming now, on foot, through the worst country in the territory, toward the only door he knew might open. It took them the better part of an hour to reach the cabin. By the time the first of them stumbled up to the dugout entrance, several were shaking so hard they could not speak. Lips gone gray, eyes glazed with the deep, dangerous weariness of the badly chilled. Hollis reached her first. He pulled off one frozen glove with stiff and clumsy fingers, and he looked at Marin with an expression she had never seen on his weathered face before. It was something close to grief. "The big stove in the meeting house went out," he said, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Second night of the storm. The pipes froze solid after that, and we couldn't get it lit again." He drew a shaking breath. "Folks crowded in there, thinking it was the safest place. Then it went cold, and it kept going colder, and there was nothing to be done. They started burning the furniture, just to keep the rooms above freezing. Burned the benches, burned the chairs, burned anything that would catch." A woman behind him lowered her head and began, very quietly, to weep into her scarf. Hollis's jaw worked. "A family down by the low end of town," he said. "They had a little one, and the little one." He could not finish it. He did not have to. Marin felt the cold of it settle into her, deeper than any winter cold. Somewhere out there, beyond the white, a family had lost a child to this storm. A child who might have been Posey's age, who might have laughed the same way. She looked past the gathered, shivering people toward the place where the town should have been. No smoke rose from it, not one thread. The whole town had gone dark and cold and silent. And then Hollis lifted his frost-rimed face, and he looked up at the buried roof of her small, strange house, at the thin, low ribbon of smoke rising off it, at the patch of bare, wet earth where the snow had melted clear away from the warmth trapped beneath. "We saw it," he said, "all the way from the ridge, the snow melting back off your roof from underneath. No great chimney smoke, just heat. Heat coming up through the ground itself, where there shouldn't have been any heat left in all the world." He shook his head slowly, the disbelief still raw in his old eyes. "You're the only warm thing left standing in this whole country, Mrs." And behind him, at the back of the ragged, frozen line, Garrett Kincaid slowly lifted his head. He looked at the buried door, the same door he had once, from the comfort of his saddle, called a grave with a roof. And now he stood swaying in the killing cold, white to the bone, waiting for the woman he had cast out, to decide whether or not she would let him in. Marin looked at him for a long moment. A long, long moment. There would have been a kind of justice in it, to let him stand there, to let him feel, for even a minute, the cold she had felt the night his door clicked shut behind her, to make him ask, to make him beg. Some part of her, some small and human and wounded part, wanted exactly that. But she thought of Posey, sleeping warm and easy below. She thought of the old man's notebook, left open on a stone bench for whoever might come next. She thought of Della, walking the cold road just to leave food by a stranger's door. And she thought of her husband, gone now, who had loved this hard, cruel brother of his all the same. And she found that the wanting fell away. Marin stepped back from the entrance, and she opened the door of the buried house wide. "All of you," she said, "come in. Come down out of the cold. There's room. The house will hold you." They came down into the buried cabin one after another, stamping snow from their boots, dragging frozen cold across the floorboards, crowding into the small dry space. And then, slowly, a strange confusion spread across their faces. There was no roaring fire. There was no glowing iron stove, no great blaze pouring heat into the room. Only a small, low, almost humble fire, burning quiet in the hearth. And yet, the cold stopped. The moment the door closed behind them, the moment they were down inside the still dry air of the buried walls, the terrible bite of the cold simply let go of their skin. It was not warm exactly, not the way a roaring hearth is warm, but it was steady, dry, livable. The kind of air a body could rest in. The kind of air that did not hurt. People who had been certain they were dying stood blinking in the low light, feeling their faces thaw, not understanding how. Several of them drifted, almost without meaning to, toward the long stone bench beside the hearth. A woman laid her bare hand against the rock, and her eyes went wide. "It's warm," she whispered. "The stone is warm, but the fire's hardly anything at all. How is the stone warm?" Marin did not explain it then. There would be time for explaining later. She only moved through the crowded room, handing out the blankets she had, settling the worst chilled nearest the bench, taking the smallest children and pressing their cold hands against the warm stone where Posey had pressed hers every night. The children stopped shivering first. That was always the way of it, she would come to learn. The little ones thawed first and quickest. Soon there were small faces beginning to color again, small voices beginning to murmur, where minutes before there had been only gray silence. And in the corner, lowering himself slowly down against the wall beneath a borrowed blanket, was Garrick. He had not spoken since they entered. He sat with his frozen hands held out toward the small fire, and he stared at the room around him, at the packed walls, at the low, quiet flames, at the impossible warmth in the stone, at the woman moving calm and sure among the people he had been so certain she would get killed. And for a while, the only sounds in the buried house were the murmur of thawing voices, and the soft crackle of the small fire, and the slow, low breathing of the draft beneath the floor. Then Garrick cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but in that quiet, everyone heard it. He was trying, even now, frozen and humbled and saved, to find some footing, some trace of the authority he had carried into the draw on horseback. "We'll need to organize," he said. His voice came out rough and weak, but he pushed on. "Ration the food. Set a watch. Someone ought to take charge here, before this turns to chaos. We can't just... You'll keep quiet in this house." The words cut across the room like an axe through dry wood. It was Hollis Dorn. The old rancher had risen up from where he sat, and he turned slowly, and he fixed Garrick with a look as cold and hard as the storm outside. The whole room went still. "This woman," Hollis said, "kept 2 children alive through 4 nights of the worst storm this country has ever known, with dirt and stone and a dead man's notebook, and nothing else but her own 2 hands and her own stubborn heart." He took a step toward Garrick. while the rest of us burned our chairs and watched our pipes freeze and lost what we lost. She sat down here, in the place you called a grave, and she breathed easy. And now she's opened her door to every one of us, including you. His old eyes did not waver. So you'll show this woman some respect while you're under her roof, or you'll go back out into that snow and find your own way. There's no third thing. The silence stretched. Every eye in the buried house was on Garrick now, and Marin watched her husband's brother sit there, beneath a borrowed blanket, in a house he had mocked, saved by a woman he had wronged, with the whole shivering town as witness. She watched the last of his certainty crumble. There was no argument left in him, and no bluster either. He simply lowered his eyes to the floor, and his shoulders came down, and something in him that had been rigid for a very long time finally broke and let go. Marin did not gloat. She said nothing in her own defense, and nothing against him. She had no need to. Hollis had said it all, and the warm stone had said the rest. Instead, she crossed the crowded room. She picked up one more wool blanket, the good one, the heavy one Della had carried up the cold road and left by her door, and she walked to the corner, and she knelt down in front of Garrick, and she held it out to him. For a long moment, he only stared at it. This man who had handed her a thin envelope and a folded deed and turned his back. This man who had called her a fool and tried to take her son and ridden away, certain he would never see her alive again. She was offering him the warmest thing she owned. "You're cold," Marin said quietly. "Take it." Garrick looked up at her, and his face, in the low firelight, was the face of a man seeing something he did not have the words for. A man who had spent his whole strength building walls of certainty and cruelty around a grief he could not carry, and was watching now as a woman he had cast out reached straight through all of it and offered him warmth anyway. His hand shook as he took the blanket. "I'm sorry," he said, so low that perhaps only she heard it. "Marin, I'm sorry." "I know," she said, and she meant it. Not as forgiveness exactly, not all at once. Forgiveness like that is not a single thing a person hands across a room, but it was a beginning. It was a door, opened wide, the same way she had opened the one above. The town stayed 3 more days in the buried house, until the cold broke enough for them to make the long walk home. And in those 3 days, the people who had once whispered about the frost pit, and the foolish widow, and the children she was surely going to bury, came to understand exactly what they were standing inside of. It was on the second of those days that Marin told them about Josiah Crane. She brought up the notebook from the cellar, and by the light of the small fire, with the whole town gathered close to listen, she read them his lessons. Cold kills the wet man first. Stone keeps what fire leaves behind. A low house lives where a tall one dies. She read the part about the still walls, and the buried trench, and the patient breathing of the house. And the people listened the way people listen when their lives have just been saved by something they do not understand. But it was near the very back of the notebook that Marin found the pages she had never read before, pages she had skipped in those first desperate weeks, hunting only for the lessons that would keep her children alive. Those pages were different. The hand was the same rough slant, but the words were not instructions. They were a kind of confession. written by a man alone in the dark, with no one left to write them for. And as Marin read them quietly to herself, her hand began to tremble. Josiah Crane had not always lived alone in that draw. Once, long before, he had come to that country with a family of his own, a wife, children. He did not say how many. He did not say their names. Some griefs, even a plain blunt man cannot set down in full. He had built them a house above the ground, a tall house, a proud house, with a fine high chimney and a great roaring hearth. And one winter a storm had come, and the tall, proud house had not been enough. He wrote of it in only a few short lines, but the few lines were enough. He had lost them, all of them. In a single terrible season, the cold had taken everything Josiah Crane had ever loved, while he stood helpless beside a fire that warmed nothing but the sky. And after that, he had not left the draw. He had stayed, and he had spent the rest of his years digging down into the earth, building low instead of tall, learning every hard lesson the winter had to teach. Not to save himself. He no longer cared much whether he was saved. He had built it, so that no other family would ever have to learn what he had learned, the way he had learned it. The last line on the last page was the one that broke her. "I cannot bring mine back," the old man had written, "but I can leave this open for whoever comes next. Let them find it. Let them live. Let that be enough." Marin sat very still in the crowded firelit room, the notebook open in her lap, and she understood, at last, why the cellar had felt preserved instead of abandoned, why the notebook had been left out in the open, on the stone bench, where the next desperate soul would be sure to find it. It had not been forgotten. It had been left, on purpose, as a gift, by a grieving man reaching across all the silent years to strangers he would never meet, a man who had lost everything and turned his loss into the thing that saved a widow and her 2 children, and then a whole frozen town. The kindness had been buried in the ground the whole time, waiting for someone willing to dig for it. When the spring finally came, the draw was a different place. The snow pulled back, the creek ran free and loud, green pushed up through the wet black earth, and the wind that moved through the hollow no longer sounded like a predator hunting in the dark. It sounded only like wind, and people kept coming to the buried house, not frightened now, not fleeing, coming on purpose in the soft spring light to learn. Homesteaders came first, asking Marin to show them how ash-packed walls held still air better than solid timber. Then ranchers, wanting to know how to dig a dry cellar beneath a cabin. Even stonemasons from the far settlements walked the buried draft trench with their lanterns, studying how a dead trapper had taught the cold to flow low beneath a floor, instead of through the room where a family slept. Marin never called herself a builder. She never claimed to have invented any of it. She only taught what the winter had proven, and what the old man had written down. Keep a house dry. Keep the draft low. Store your heat in stone, instead of chasing it with a great fire. And never, ever let dampness settle where the people sleep. The notebook stayed open beside the hearth most evenings, while she copied Josiah Crane's lessons out into simpler words and clearer drawings, so that other families could carry them home. By summer, no one called the place the Frost Pit anymore. They called it the Ember House, because of the way it held its warmth, long and quiet after the flame had gone. Garrick did not stay in the country. When the snow cleared enough for travel, he came to the buried house one last time, on foot this time, hat in his hands. He stood in the doorway a long while before he could speak. "I sold the farm," he said at last. "Your husband's farm. I couldn't stay in it. Not after this winter. Not after what I tried to do." Marin waited. "I came to give you something," Garrick said. "I should have given it to you long ago. The night I locked that door instead of the money. I was a coward and I kept it back, and I have been ashamed of it every day since." He drew a folded paper from inside his coat. It was old, worn soft at the creases, as though it had been carried a long time and read many times in secret. "He wrote it," Garrick said. His voice was thick. "Your husband. At the very end, when he knew. He gave it to me to give to you. And I never could. I told myself I was protecting you. The truth is, I couldn't bear to be the one to hand it over. I couldn't bear to let him be that gone." He held it out. Marin took the letter from her husband's brother with hands that had grown strong over the long winter. She did not open it then. Not in front of him. Some things are not for sharing. But she held it to her chest, and she felt the weight of it, and she looked at the broken man in her doorway. "Thank you, Garrick," she said softly, "for bringing it, even now, even late." He nodded. His eyes were wet. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I know what I did. I know what it cost. That family down in the town. That child. If I'd had any sense, if I'd built like you instead of judging you, maybe—" "Stop," Marin said gently. "You can't carry the whole storm, Garrick. None of us could have stopped it. All any of us can do is learn, and then teach, the way the old man did." She paused. "The way you can, now, wherever you're going." Garrick looked at her for a long moment, and something passed across his face that she had never seen there before. Not the cold certainty, not the cruelty. Something younger, something almost free. "He was right about you," he said quietly. "My brother. He always said you were the strong one. I never believed him." A broken little laugh. "I do now." Then he set his hat back on his head, and he turned, and he walked away up the spring-soft trail. She never saw him again. But the people who passed through that country, in the years that followed, would sometimes carry word of him. A man traveling the far settlements, they said. A quiet man, helping families dig dry cellars before the winters came, teaching them to build low and patient and warm, carrying the old man's lessons outward into places the notebook would never reach, making, in his own slow way, a kind of amends that had no end to it. Marin read her husband's letter alone that night by the light of the small fire after the children were asleep. She never told anyone what it said, but those who knew her noticed that she seemed lighter after. That some old weight she had carried since the day the door first locked behind her had finally been set down. She kept the letter in the cellar, beside the notebook. 2 messages from 2 men long gone. One who had loved her, one who had built the place that saved her. Both of them speaking, still, across the silence, to the living. The Ember House did not stay a place of fear. It became, over the years, a place people came to learn how to live. And not only how to live through a winter, they came to learn what the widow had learned in the cold and the dark. That strength is not the same as standing tall. That sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stay low and stay warm and outlast the worst of it. That the help we need is often buried right beneath our feet, waiting for us to be humble enough and stubborn enough to dig. And that even a man who has wronged you, frozen and ashamed in your doorway, deserves a blanket, because the warmth we give away is the only warmth that lasts. On a quiet evening late that spring, Maren sat outside the entrance of the Ember House, watching the last of the light fade across the green and open land. Inside, the two children were at the hearth. Asa knelt beside one of the narrow floor cracks near the long stone bench, and in his hand he held a single candle, lit, its small flame steady in the still air. "Watch," he said to his sister. "Watch what it does." He lowered the candle slowly toward the crack, and the little flame bent gently inward, drawn down toward the hidden trench beneath the floor, exactly the way Maren had once watched it bend, on a night when she had wondered if she had carried her children into a grave. Posey's eyes went wide. "It moved," she whispered. "Asa." It moved. The fire moved all by itself. "It's the breath of the house," Asa told her, with all the solemn certainty of a boy who has earned what he knows. "That's how you can tell it's alive. That's how you know it's working. You hold the light low, and you watch which way it wants to go." Posey leaned in close, her small face glowing in the candlelight. And then she smiled. Out at the entrance, Maren rested one hand on the long stone bench beside her, the way she had 1,000 times. The morning's fire had been dead for hours. The stone was still warm. She listened to her children's voices, low and easy in the dusk. She felt the slow breath of the house moving beneath her hand, and she watched the small candle flame, far inside, bending gently toward the dark, carrying the old man's knowledge forward, one more time, into hands that would carry it forward again. The earth had never promised her comfort, only shelter for those willing to learn its rules. And in the quiet of that spring evening, with the warm stone beneath her palm, and her children's laughter in the doorway, and a long life opening up ahead of them, that was more than enough. The house breathed, the children laughed, and the warmth went on long after the flame had gone.